cover crops. Cover crops are an important part of the market garden for many different ways. In this tutorial, we'll show you how to seed them and deal with them once they're done. But before we move on, I just want to quickly go by why you would want to use the cover crops in the market garden. As I pull this out, you see these little nodules. And these are the ones responsible for fixing the nitrogen that the vetch is growing. And the vetch is growing around the stem of rye. So that's why we do both of them together. But that's how you know that your legumes are fixing the nitrogen, is by pulling them out and looking at the root system and seeing those little nodules. You know, these are crops that are not making money, so they're taking time and space out of your market garden. And so there's a cost to using the cover crops. But one of the things that they do that is hard to replace with something else is that they bring a deep root system to your soil. And so the cover crops, or green manure, if you can call them that too, you know, on bigger mechanized systems, they're used to suppress the weed, or they're used to add organic matter to the soil, or even nitrogen by the fact that we're planting legumes and then they're bringing legumes back into the soil. All of these are key functions of green manure. But in the market garden, you know, we can rely on compost to do a lot of that. Bring organic matter, bring nitrogen. But the one thing that the cover crop is the only one that we can really do is to bring food to your soil web without disturbing the ecology of the soil, without turning under organic matter, compost or straw or whatever. The fact that the cover crop is growing on the soil and that its root system is going into the soil, you know, opening it, penetrating it, creating, you know, all sorts of little environments there for your earthworms and for your soil web to chew on it, is really what's awesome about cover crops. And so that's the key here, is that you're covering your soil, especially for winter times. You should have cover crops or tarps or whatever else that covers your soil when you put your market garden to sleep in the winter. And if you're growing year round, then you should have at least 8 to 10 weeks where the soil can rest with a nice cover crop that's growing on it. So there would be more to say about it, but I want to keep it to the simple facts. We're growing cover crops because A, they cover the soil, B, they are generating a lot of roots into the soil that are feeding your soil web. And then if you're applying a living soil approach to the market garden, then the question is how to deal with them once, you know, they've reached their maturity, like it's the case here. So we'll show you that, and it starts by seeding at the right density and doing it all well. Then you're mowing it, and then you are taking the soil from the aisle, shooting it onto your beds, and then tarping it. And that's how you incorporate the cover crop. When seeding cover crops, there are 3 principles that I think are really good to follow and that we're following here. And the first one is that you want to be seeding your cover crops into soil that is already clean. And so that makes a big difference, because the last thing you want to do is seed a cover crop in soil that will grow all sorts of weeds or residues or whatever, and then you're left with a mess and most probably weed seeds that are going to come up. And so whenever I do a cover crop, what I want to have beforehand is a black tarp that was destroying what was growing beforehand, and then I'm seeding the cover crop into a clean slate. So tarps could be there for 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks, depending on where you're at your season, but you definitely want to start with a clean slate. Number 2, if you're using the cover crop to really develop the root system, and there's, you know, it's one of the best reasons why you would want to grow cover crop, having the roots shoot down, making sure that it's feeding the soil at different depth, and also decompacting the soil as much as possible. It's a really good idea to use a broad fork prior to seeding your cover crop. It's more work, and you might not see the benefit, but if you have soil that is really loose, the root systems will shoot down better and faster, and then your cover crop will colonize much more of the subsoil. So number 2 for me is to use a broad fork when seeding the cover crop. If you are seeding a cover crop in soil that is really, really compact, it might be a good idea to use a subsoiler even. So you can mount that on a little tractor. It would be a teat that would go even further down, breaking the hard pans, breaking the crust, and then you want to have cover crops. So that's number 2. You're making sure that you are creating the best conditions for your roots to shoot down. Number 3 is that I am putting a high density ratios of different seeds. And so the mixture, I won't go into that. So the mixture of what you're seeding where depends on what you want to do. And the more the merrier. The more different seeds you can have together, you can rye and vetch and clover and whatever you're putting together. Diversity is king, but you want to do it at a high application rate, much more than what you're seeing on the seed package. And the reasons for that is you quickly want to have your cover crop get established, and so it's going to shade out the weed and not leave enough space for the weeds to come up and compete with the cover crop. And so you won't have to come back and weed your cover crops because you don't want to have any weeds going to seed. And so the density and the application rates are really high. So there's more cost up front. It's going to cost you more seeds, but in the end, you're a winner because you'll have an amazing cover crop that quickly takes all the space. So that's what we're trying to do. We're following these 3 steps, and we'll do it in motion. So now I'm taking out the tarp, I'm broad forking, and then depending on which cover crop I'm using, I'm going to do a mixture of each of which. I quickly tell you, so we're using a bucket, and we're hand broadcasting the seeds. And I'm not seeding into the aisles. I'm only seeding onto the bed. And the reason I'm doing that is the aisles later on are harder to control because my flail mower flails, 30-inch or 75 centimeters. And then I'm usually left with the pathways that is harder to handle. And so I don't seed them. I only seed the beds, and I leave the pathways clear. So that's that, and you'll just see what I do. I finish everything off by burying the seeds, which is really important. You want to make sure that you have a good seed to soil contact and the seeds are just a bit buried so that they'll germinate and so that the birds are not coming in and eating them too much. And the best way I know to do that is to use a rotor tiller on the walk behind tractor that you want to go in 2nd gear, shallow, and just quickly till the first inch of the soil, just burying the seeds. So that's a fast, efficient, economical way to make sure that your seeds are well buried. So that's it. So these are the steps. Okay, so when making your mix, there's a few things that you need to know. And it doesn't really matter what the mixes are, but you probably want to put a legume in, and the legumes will have the amazing capacity to fix the nitrogen out of the sky and bringing it into your soil, but there needs to be a rhizobium that helps make that relationship happen. And so whenever you're putting legumes, you perhaps want to make sure that you're adding some rhizobiums to mix with your legumes. And so you buy that in the form of these little powder. They're little bags that you buy, and then you can just mix them in, and then to make sure that that relationship will happen in your soil. So legumes, let's say I'm using peas or vetch. I want them to grow tall. They have a tendency to kind of spread sometimes, and I'll mix them with different cereals. And so today what I'm mixing is cowpeas and wheat. And whatever else I'm adding into the mix, I want to make sure that the story blend. And then I'm also adding sometimes a little bit of fertility in that mix just to make sure that it really sparks up well. And so we're mixing everything. Again, it's your own recipe. So these are the peas. Start with those. So then I'll be adding the rhizobium. Bringing in the cereals. So in this mix now that I'm doing, it's going to be pretty much half and half. And for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm adding some clover today. And the clover, the trick to get clover, because clover seeds are really, really tiny. And the trick to have them spread evenly is that you mix half and half with sand. And so you buy sand that, concrete sand or whatever, and you just mix half and half the clover and the sand. Mix everything in. So here's my clover. Just my sand. And I mix those two because otherwise if you're just seeding clover, it's just like way too much clover that's going to spread out because it's so thin, and we're hand casting everything. So I mix those two. And then I always finish with some fertilizers, fish meal or blood meal, whatever. And then we're mixing it all. So it doesn't need to be as elaborated. It could be more, it could be less. It doesn't really matter. I'm taking a lot of extra steps here, but when you're doing the cover crop, you want to make sure that they're really awesome cover crops, and you should treat them just as if you're planting a crop, because in the end it's adding a lot of benefits to your soil. And so all these extra steps, I'm taking the time to mixing a lot of different seeds together. I'm putting the inoculum in there for the rhizobium to relationships to be present, and then I'm adding some fertility in there, and I'm using good seeds. All of that combined, and the fact that we're broad forking and then we're starting from beds that have been tarped, all of these extra steps, I think in the end will make a big difference with regards to the overall health of your soil and the cover crop. And so once everything's mixed, I'm using a bucket and put it into a bucket. So it's usually, my application rates are usually 1/3 of a bucket per 100-foot bed, 30-meter beds. And so if I have one bucket, I'll be able to do my 3 beds. And so you'll come up with your own ratios, but again, the name of the game is to broadcast enough seed so that it quickly spreads, and then your cover crop is out competing the weeds. And the density will play a big role in that. And so then, once I'm ready, it's just about hand casting the seeds onto the bed. Okay, so for this now, the last step is to bury my seeds, and for that I'm using the rototiller. And I'm using the rototiller because, contrary to the power harrow, the rototiller won't spread out the seeds, it'll just bury them. And the harrow usually tends to kind of spreads them out, and it plays with the density, and I don't like it. It doesn't give a good result. So I'm just using the flat out rototiller, and I'll be lifting it so that we're using it in second gear, going really fast, going really shallow. And what we want to do is just bury those seeds. For now on the farm here, this is an experimental farm, and I have a roller in the back of the rototiller, which makes this operation really sweet because I can really adjust the roller to 1 inch and then gently roll on it. But if you don't have a roller like this, you just need to lift it, and so that you're you're manually controlling the depth of your tillage. And so that's it. Once you put your seeds, you need to make sure that you're burying them. Really important, what we're doing here is we're not tilling. You don't want to go deep. You really want to go shallow just to make sure that the seeds are a bit buried and then there's soil covering them a little bit. And so this is a really shallow operation. In the case that you didn't have a rototiller, you could always use a rake and just pass vigorously. You could use a wheel hoe also to shuffle back and forth the soil, making sure that it's covering the seeds. But definitely the rototiller at second gear, shallow, is really the fastest way to do this. And once it's seeded, all the steps are done. The last step, if it's not going to rain, is to just use a sprinkler, turn it on, make sure that it's moist, and then your cover crops are good to go from there on. Okay, so now we're ready to get rid of this nice cover crop. Usually it depends on when you have another crop coming in, but you want to do this at least 2 weeks prior to transplanting or direct seeding, or maybe perhaps differently if you're seeding directly into it. But for the time being, what we're doing is we're mowing it, and we're using a flail mower. And the flail mower is very different than the lawn mower, which would cut at the bottom of the long stem, which in the end would take a long time for the green manure to decompose in the soil. The flame mower has little blades, and it's cutting all of the long stem into shorter pieces, and in the end you're left with a really nice mulch that decomposes really fast. Much easier for your soil web to digest the cover crop when it's mowed. And so you want to have the right walk behind tractor with the right number of horsepower, but this will go through pretty much anything. So I'm going to mow it, and then I'll explain the next step afterward. So we've just mowed the cover crop, and that one was really thick. You see what kind of job it does? That's really awesome. That's going to be awesome food for the earthworms in the soil web. And so now what we want to do is make sure that this green organic matter gets digested by your soil, and the best way to do that is put some soil over it. So on most farms, what they'll do is they'll either rototill or plow it in. But we don't want to do this because we are adopting minimal tillage or no-till strategies. And so the way to go around that is to take the dirt from the aisle and shoot it on over your bed. And when you do that, you're not disturbing the ecology, you're not mixing your layers, you're not fooling around with your soil structure. You're keeping it intact, but you're still covering it with soil, which is what you want to do to help the soil digest your organic matter as fast as possible. So we'll do that, and then we'll even cover it with a black tarp, giving your soil web, all the animals that are in the soil, spiders, microbial life, earthworms, the best environment possible for them to decompose your cover crop. Because it's dark, because it's moist, you're tricking them thinking it's nighttime, and they'll be coming up chewing on this organic matter 24/7. It's really awesome. And so that's the trick. This explains why I prefer often to not seed in the aisles. It's because you tend to see them a bit more. And so when it's time to raise your beds, you have a clear a clear sight of your 30-inch, 18-inch, or 18-inch, 13-inch. And so that's one of the reasons why I like to seed mostly on the bed and not on the 18-inch pat, so that you can see them when it's time to raise your beds after you've mowed down your cover crop. So again, just awesome stuff. This is beautiful.